Oh, hi. Didn't see you there. As you could tell, I was just spending a relaxing evening reading some books and thought I would make a quick video. This time around, actually, I didn't want to focus on a more academic topic like my previous videos. I wanted this to be a little bit more fun, a little bit more accessible. And so, what I want to do is talk about a video, really kind of a video response. If you're old enough to have been around on YouTube, oh, I don't know, 4 years ago, there used to be this thing called video responses where you could reply to someone else's video with a video. They don't have that feature anymore, but I'm actually going to be. This video is inspired by one that Angela Benedict did, which I highly recommend you go watch. I will have the link in the show notes. And in that video, she talked about this book, actually, Mick Mercer's The Goth Bible. And she kind of talked about ephemera from previous decades and how Goths kind of got information, how information was passed around before the internet, or at least when, the internet was in its infancy even. And she's doing probably the coolest project I've seen anyone do on YouTube. She's actually sending her copy of this book around the world or around the country. If you want to get in on it, basically, she has the instructions on her page, but she will send this book to someone, and they will get the chance to put something of theirs in there, something related to goth, something personal, and send it on to the next person, and send it and send it and send it. And it's one of the coolest projects. It's really it really reminded me of my early days in goth, and just as a kid, when you had pen pals, when you had you would mail things to people. You would make stuff with your hands and send it. You would pass around flyers. You would in your local group do projects. You would like take notes in a book and give it to someone else. They would do their notes and that kind of thing. And it's really cool. Of course, the internet is easier access, but it's really something special to be able to get a physical object from someone and see their personal touches, because it doesn't take a lot of effort to type something online. It takes a little more effort to make a YouTube video, but that's not as personal. But when you get something from someone that's personal, that's been physically crafted, there's something special about knowing they took the time and the effort and the love and the care behind it. The DIY and the ethos of the goth scene. It's really kind of a cool thing. So check out that video, get in on that project. I'm super excited about it. Hopefully I'll get that book at some point. But what I wanted to talk about just briefly was kind of go over some of the goth ephemera from my youth. So first of all, Mick Mercer, that book was from 97, I think. And I believe this was from 2002, 21st Century Goth. And basically what he does in each of these is, he's got some interviews in there. He's got some historical documentation, but he saved most of that for his goth rock books. But what he does is he just lists stuff. I think these are bands right now, but he lists retailers and bands and even people. Here's a section on people, like models and people who make clothing and all this kind of stuff. And this was the kind of thing that people would buy to get like a physical compendium. This is like the physical internet, basically. Now, my book for me was this one. This is Nancy Kilpatrick's The Goth Bible. And I believe this came out in 2004. Yeah. And this is essentially the same thing, but it's got a lot more writing in it, essays and things. She actually outsourced. So the book starts off with her talking about what goth is, and she had DJs and promoters and band members and just like net goths. That was what they some people were called back in the day. Uh, Physically write letters, and she put those letters in the book about what they think goth is, and some of them wrote essays. And then there's sections of it where it's just lists of websites and retailers. And this book specifically I prefer a little bit because she actually writes about. It's not just list after list. She's actually writing about specific details about the shops and stuff like that. But the other one's pretty cool too because it has interviews and things. So this was really my compendium back in the day. But it wasn't just collections. If you wanted to stay up to date more in real time, you had to either be part of the scene or you had to get magazines. So I have a few examples. First one, I'm just pulling off the top of my whatever I grabbed here. This is actually a local Chicago zine run by a friend of mine. You can buy this online. I was cool enough to be able to buy it at a concert from her. But it's it's great. It's got a bunch of people from Chicago writing about events, writing about. There's interviews with Scary Lady Sarah there. There's some photography. It's all local based stuff, and that's really, really cool. There's some interviews with bands. There's even advertisers in there. There's a late bar and all kinds of stuff. Really fucking rad. Probably my favorite international zine is called Spider's Web. I don't have any with me right now because the ones I did have I actually gifted to someone, because that's what you did back in the day. If you couldn't buy the magazine, and even if you could, a lot of times people would pass the zines around, and that's how information got around. Especially if you would go to a festival, people would actually haul their zines and magazines with them and talk to people about it. I had that experience too. People would bring it was a little bit later, but people were bringing Gothic Beauty magazines. They were bringing some harder to get magazines from Japan. There were a couple. There might have been 3 or 4 magazines coming out in like the early 2000s, late 90s, from Japan that were all about the like Gothic Lolita and the horror, the kind of like horror Gothic metal scene and other goth Japanese stuff. And a few others here. Oh, this is another example of a zine. This one is actually a poetry zine, and these were also something I used to buy. And I actually made one at some point, but I only made a couple copies. And yeah, I don't know if these are even around. Nobody really reads poetry anymore, so that one's not that old though. So going along, okay, so I have a couple examples of Propaganda magazine. If you don't know what this is, this was a huge magazine, most well known in New York, but it's still pretty famous and infamous, really, these days. These are a couple copies I have. You can still probably buy some from Fred Berger, but if you don't know what Propaganda magazine is, it's, I think, really important historically to not just goth, but a lot of alternative underground subcultures. So I'm going to put a link. I did a interview with the guy who started the website, the magazine, and it's like 40 minutes long, and I'll put a link to that in under the video. I highly suggest listening to it. It goes through the history of from the late 80s all the way up till the magazine was discontinued, and really chronicles the history of the goth scene and a bunch of other stuff. Now we're getting into some stuff that was important to me when I was younger. This magazine, Dark Realms. There was another, I can't remember it. There was another magazine very similar to this that I don't seem to have any left over. But this wasn't just goth, right? This is more like what you think of a proper magazine where they have movie reviews and album reviews, but also, the big interviews. Not even sure what's in here. Sarah Bishop, I don't know who that is. Um, but it wasn't just goth stuff. It was metal stuff. It was like weird oddities, stuff about tarot cards, stuff about witchcraft, and all those kind of things. This magazine was important to me because the first time I had ever heard of the video game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was when I read a review in this magazine, and it sounded absolutely incredible. And at which point I went out to my local Hot Topic, I think, and bought the game. And absolutely still my favorite game of all time. I just replayed it a couple years ago. But that's how you found out about stuff. Or at least for me. And I think back in the day, you read a review somewhere and thought, hey, that's something I'm looking for. And sometimes it was shit. But sometimes, like in that case, I found something that totally changed my life. That was my first introduction to that kind of role playing game. Here's an artist kind of thing. So kind of like a Gothic Beauty kind of thing. I don't know if this predates it, but this was my favorite magazine back in the day. I didn't even bring any Gothic Beauties. I've got a stack of like 50 of them downstairs. This was just cool because Extra X is a online shop that carries goth stuff in Gothic clothing in Germany. And this was important because I ordered some stuff from the store. They sent this with it. These kinds of things, just fashion pamphlet. Well, I don't know what you call this, but these were just as important and would get passed around just as much in the scene because, at least for me, internet access was still pretty limited. And so being able to kind of get a look at, you've got so many different style inspirations in one place. And when you didn't have Facebook pages or MySpace pages where you could just browse through a whole bunch of diverse pictures of goths, this kind of thing was really great for trying to figure out what your style was and get inspirations. Industrial Nation, another great magazine. I only got a few issues of this, I think, because it was kind of expensive, if I remember right. But this was all industrial. And you know what? This is, I don't know of, there's, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's a lot less types of industrial ephemera from the past. It didn't seem like that scene was as big into, magazines and this kind of thing, micromedia, as it were, as goth was. And I could be wrong. It might not have just been my scene, but this was pretty cool for keeping up with industrial for me. And then Orcus was another big magazine back in the day. And I think this was also from Germany, but they, interviewed a lot of Gothic artists. Thinking about it now, there was really, in the 90s, early 2000s, I think is when it started to all die off, but there was a big explosion of micromedia. If you're looking for more details on this kind of stuff, there's a few books I would suggest. First of all, Somewhere Leather, Somewhere Lace. There's a lot of photos of zines and flyers for events. Flyers for events were another huge thing. Like, those would get passed around everywhere. You could not go to an event and not be handed a flyer for something. That was like the lifeblood of a scene in a city, because that was, if you didn't have a zine, and you had to actually buy those, so those were harder to get. Flyers were the lifeblood, because your community before the internet existed around actually going out and talking to people. So if you didn't know where the next event was taking place, then you were shit out of luck. Another book would be Goth by Paul Hodkinson. I think the subtitle is Style, Identity, and Something. But he's got a whole section in there about, it's a more sociology minded book, but there's a whole section about micromedia and subcultural media. And he has a lot of examples and stories of how it was important back in the day, but he also talks about the social significance of cultural media, how that type of thing bonded members across states and across countries, and how it kind of was really vital to the longevity and the meaningfulness of a subculture. And I think another book, The Art of Gothic, I believe that also has a section. Well, actually, probably throughout most of it, I think there's stuff about subcultural media and magazines and things in there. So that's some of my ephemera, and hopefully it was more than just showing you pictures of things. Hopefully that kind of gave you a window into what, and again, off the top of my head, but what the culture was like back in the day before we had the internet. So check out Angela Benedict's video. I would add that coming up in a few days, the new Cemetery Confessions podcast is coming out, and in that one, I'm doing an interview with William Faith of Faith and the Muse and Scary Lady Sarah, who has been running Nocturna in Chicago, the largest goth and alternative night for the last 29 years. It was a wonderful interview. If you're interested in the history and kind of a window into what it was like back then, I recommend it, because we kind of go through that. William got into the scene in the early to mid 80s, and he was, playing with bands like Christian Death, and all those bands in the LA scene. So we kind of go through some of that. We go up to the present. We kind of talk about a bunch of stuff. So I think you'll really enjoy it. And that's it. Thanks again for watching. I don't know what my next video will be, but I'm sure it'll be the best fucking thing on the internet. So thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you guys next time.